And that combination with the aroma of the food is what gives our experience a flavor. So for example, without a sense of smell, you would not know the difference between an apple and a potato if you weren't looking at it. And one way to really prove this to yourself that it's all about breathing is to take something like a jelly bean, pop it in your mouth and plug your nose. So just chew on it and you'll just be sweet, and then release your nostrils and you'll be like, oh my God, it's grapefruit, it's banana.
Let's say you've had your sourdough starter for 20 years or so, and you've just, you've maintained it, you've fed it, continued it. Now, what happens, every time you passage it or feed it, it evolves. So no matter if you've been maintaining it, for a long time, it's going to change. It's not going to be what it was when it first started.
Good evening to you out there. I am Edgar B. Herwick III from GBH's Curiosity Desk. And tonight, I am your host, your guide for our virtual Boston Talks. Thank you so much for being with us live from my living room in Somerville, Massachusetts. For those of you joining us from the area, it's a beautiful night outside. And for the first time in a long time that we've been doing these Boston Talks at 7 o'clock, still a little bit of light outside. So thank you for taking the time on a beautiful evening to be with us. Tonight, our theme, which we like to have for our Boston Talks, is one that I am really excited about, which is food and science. Two things that I know a lot of folks love, including myself. We've got two incredible speakers with us tonight. We're going to learn a little bit about them and their work. Vayu Maini Rekdal, Dr. Vayu Maini Rekdal, who is a scientist, an educator, and a chef. And we've also got Dr. Rachel Herz, who is a neuroscientist and perhaps the world's leading expert on the psychological science of smell. We will find out a little bit about why that is incredibly important to everything that has to do with food. Enough about me yapping and yapping. Let's bring out our first guest, bring her up to the screen, Dr. Rachel Herz. As I said, neuroscientist, somebody working in a space we might call neurogastronomy. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Well, Rachel, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. Maybe you could start me off and tell me a little bit about what the heck neurogastronomy is.
The answer to that question is, it's a term that was coined by Gordon Shepherd at Yale University in 2006. And what he was doing was really looking at how the brain makes flavor, how it knits together the sense of smell and taste to produce the experience of what we consider flavor. But since then, it has morphed into a field that now has its own society. It has an annual meeting, and it brings together people who work on sensory science, agriculture, psychology, neuroscience, clinical conditions, and nutrition. So it's really this huge encompassing area, and even chemistry. And it has everything to do with food.
No kidding. And so in this what sounds like a fairly broad and fairly new sort of world, your expertise is kind of in the smell category. Is that right? So yeah. How did you sort of zero in on, or at like what point in your life were you like, there's a lot of stuff that I could be studying, but I'm going to put all of my chips on the table for smell. Like, how did that happen?
Well, the sort of circuitous path of least resistance, fumbling around in graduate school, trying to figure out what I was doing with myself and trying to bring together my background in biology, because my undergrad had been in biology, and then starting doing some work in psychology, because I decided I didn't want to work sort of in the sort of wet lab any longer with animals, and trying to figure out what kind of topic would be able to marry both of those basic processes and concepts together. And I was actually reading a paper in one of the courses I was taking in graduate school where the researchers talked about manipulating mood by using smell, and they gave this sort of evolutionary explanation and they related it to the brain. And I thought, aha, smell, that's what I can work on. That's a perfect way to combine the two fields. And so off I went on my merry way. I got lucky.
So how, I wonder, like, on the one hand, I sort of go like, okay, smell, like we all smell things. I smell things all the time. Big deal. How much can you study smell? And then on the other hand, I stop and think about it and go, well, wait a minute, what is smell? And like, what happens in our brain when we smell? So what what exactly, like in your work, like what do you study as you start to become, sort of expert in the idea of this the psychological science of smell? Like, what are you actually learning and studying and figuring out?
So first of all, I want to tell you that our sense of smell is involved in everything. And actually, COVID-19 has really brought the sense of smell to the forefront for many reasons, most of which because it's an early signal of illness that many people suffer from. In fact, about over 85% of people who become sick with COVID, prior to them manifesting any other symptoms, they start to have problems being able to smell. And also there's a number of people who post recovering from all the other basic symptoms of COVID still have problems with their sense of smell. So there's been a huge burst of interest and awareness of our sense of smell, which I'm extremely grateful for, sort of the silver lining of this past year. But in terms of my personal research, what I first really got interested in was whether or not memories that were triggered by smells were different from memories that were triggered in any other way. Sort of based on this whole Proustian idea that smell memories are really special. But was there something more than just anecdote there? So my first set of experiments were on contrasting memories that were triggered by smells, visual items of the same thing, the same stimulus, touch items. So let's say popcorn. So the smell of popcorn, feeling popcorn kernels, looking at popcorn, hearing popcorn popping, and even seeing the word popcorn, and then pairing those with things that people would then have to remember and looking at what the differences were in the types of memory as a function of the trigger. And that's how I cut my teeth. And what I found out, the most primary thing, is that when a smell is triggering a memory, that memory is much more emotional and evocative. We're brought back to that original time and place, much more so than with any other kind of cue. But the accuracy of the memory isn't better.
Oh, interesting. So it's more emotionally intense, but not necessarily more accurate.
Correct. Yeah.
Which is kind of, I mean, that is sort of anecdotally what we sort of thought. You kind of, you essentially proved it. Like, it sounds like. Way to go. That's awesome. Just a reminder, if you have questions for Rachel, please right now pop them in the Q&A. We are talking about the psychological science of smell. So you sort of cut your teeth with this, and then where do you go with something like that? You sort of, as you said, you were like, aha, here's this field. You have this kind of like emerging field. You do some research, and then what do you do?
So in terms of my own personal journey, I was told when I was in graduate school that I was never going to get a job if I was studying the sense of smell, because who cares about the sense of smell?
Yeah.
So when I finished my PhD, I decided to try to make myself look a little bit more mainstream. So I did a postdoc trying to look at more of the cognitive aspects of the sense of smell. So learning and memory in a more kind of, I'm going to say, banal way, to sort of get that level of expertise as well. So looking at how the context influences our ability to remember when a smell is a cue and so on, and a couple of other variables like that. But I've always really been interested in emotion as well. And then looking at how the emotional state that you're in, how that influences your ability to then encode and then retrieve memories triggered by smell. And then subsequently to that, just sort of broadening out in all those areas, as well as working on the sense of taste and flavor and just sort of expanding outwards. And one of the things that I've also been involved with is looking at people, well, mainly because I'm working with people who have lost their sense of smell in one form or another. And prior to COVID, my primary involvement with people like that was those who have lost their sense of smell in an accident. And it's actually relatively easy to have happen if you have any kind of accident where you hit your head either here or here, because that's going to cause a shearing action of this little bone. It's a very thin bone that's basically at the level of your eyebrows, and it shears off the axons of the neurons from the sense of smell that are coming into the brain, and it can completely permanently make you lose your sense of smell. And I got into this actually working as an expert witness for people who had lost their sense of smell in a car accident, let's say. And the insurance company was like, who cares you lost your sense of smell? I mean, everything else is fine. And actually, everything about these people's lives had started to unravel and was completely falling apart. And so my job was there to say, no, actually the sense of smell is involved in everything from sexual behavior. I've also done research connected to that, intimacy, personal relationships, our sense of self, Our cognitive capabilities, even being able to navigate, spatial abilities are related to our sense of smell, all kinds of things about our life. And that's sort of where everything has sprouted in the last 20 or so years for me.
Unbelievable. So you're like, aha, I knew there would be stuff to do if I became an expert in this. Take that.
I just proved them all wrong. I have a job.
Excellent stuff. Okay, so I'm going to turn to the Q&A a bit here. We've got a bunch of questions coming in, and I've got one from Peter and one from Doreen that are similar. They're basically, Peter asks, when we smell food, is our nose, quote unquote, tasting it? Doreen asks, how does the sense of smell impact taste? You've said flavor a couple of times, so maybe talk a little bit about how smell and taste sort of work together.
Okay, well, a great question. Thank you both for giving me that question. So what happens when we're eating is, well, actually we're smelling our food twice. First of all, when the food is coming towards us or when we're just picking up our fork and we're sniffing in through our nostrils. And that's one way that we're smelling it. But the more important way is what happens when we have the food inside our mouth and we're chewing, and the aromatic molecules from the food actually are coming from the mouth. They then get into the nose because there's an open airway system between our mouth and our nose, which is why if ever you remember this, let's say you had something in your mouth and you were a kid and you were laughing and you were trying not to like spew it out of your mouth and instead it came out your nose.
Yeah.
Well, that's because of this open airway system. And also why, for instance, if you have a cold and your nose is blocked and you say food doesn't taste right, it's because that airway system is blocked. So when we breathe, we have to be breathing while we're eating, and we inhale, and that brings the aromas up to the olfactory epithelia, which is where the sensory neurons for detecting smell are. And then we exhale, and it's that whoosh of exhale that then combines with our sense of taste, which is just detecting salt, sour, sweet, and bitter in our mouth. And that combination with the aroma of the food is what gives our experience a flavor. So for example, without a sense of smell, you would not know the difference between an apple and a potato if you weren't looking at it. And one way to really prove this to yourself that it's all about breathing is to take something like a jelly bean, pop it in your mouth and plug your nose. So just chew on it and you'll just be sweet, and then release your nostrils and you'll be like, oh my God, it's grapefruit, it's banana, it's—
Oh, no kidding. So you'll sort of, without the air sort of moving, you'll sort of get sweet. You'll be like, I know this is candy, but you won't get like cherry or— no way, really?
Yes, and on top of that, what's also super cool is not only do you get the suddenly like, oh wow, now I know it's licorice or cherry, but the sweetness actually gets more intense. So it actually tastes sweeter, because what happens is the sense of the experience of smell and taste in the brain synergizes and makes them combined even more powerful together. So you have this combination, like I said at the beginning, your brain knitting together these two sensations, forming this perception. We say colloquially all the time, taste, because it seems like it's coming from our mouth. Meanwhile, it's really coming from our nose and actually really from our brain. So it's like an illusion of it being in our mouth. So often when people say, I lost my sense of taste, like that's something that people have been saying also with COVID, they actually have not lost the ability to detect salt, sour, sweet, and bitter. What they've lost is the ability to know that what they're eating is bacon and not just some salty, greasy stick.
Yeah, amazing. All right. Great questions coming in the Q&A. We've got one from Myra. So Myra says that Myra got the DNA done on 23andMe, and the results said that they would not like the smell or taste of cilantro, which they do not. Okay. So the question broadly is sense of smell and therefore taste, is it genetic?
So there are rare instances, cilantro is the perfect example, and I'll explain why in a second, that are genetic determinants of our perception of things that we eat. Now, one thing I just want to say also is that actually everyone, except if you have an identical twin, has a unique set of olfactory receptors that are expressed in your nose. So everyone has an ever so slightly different sense of smell. And as a function of that, things are going to smell ever so different. Flavors are going to be ever so different for everyone. And where this really makes an impact is in terms of intensity. So if you think something smells really strong, that could be potentially something that turns you off because it's too intense. Or if it smells really weak, you might not be getting it. And what's going on with cilantro cilantro, believe it or not, is that the people who can't stand the taste of cilantro, the flavor of cilantro, think it's like tastes like soap.
Soap, yeah.
And that's because they're missing the olfactory receptors that give it that beautiful herbaceous bouquet that those who love it, myself included, can detect. So they're actually missing a receptor for detecting a certain aspect of that compound. But that's more rare.
So if you like cilantro, you are also getting the soapy taste, but you're getting other stuff with it, and it balances it out and gives it the complexity and fullness, and you're like, yummy. Because I'm thinking, like, I like cilantro, but I also taste the soapy thing. It's just not so dominant that I don't eat it.
Exactly that.
Huh.
Yeah.
Very good. This is excellent stuff. Talking with Dr. Rachel Herz, neuroscientist, about the science of smell and therefore the science of taste. Some other great stuff in here. We've got a question from Vinay. So Vinay is asking about nutritional intake and how it's impacted by smell and psychology. So the question is specifically here is, for example, does anxiety and bad mood influence our quality of food intake or vice versa?
Yes and yes. So first of all, a couple of things. It's a big question, so I'll try to unpack it and not take too much time answering it. But first of all, when we're stressed and upset, we often turn to foods that are comfort foods for us, that foods that make us feel good, and foods that actually are neurologically rewarding. So foods that are high in fat, high in carbohydrates, high in sugars are all foods which actually turn on the reward centers of our brain. So they actually make us feel good. The feeling inside our mouth, even before we've swallowed it, of sweet, creamy taste actually turns our brain on to be all happy. So that's one aspect of it. But believe it or not, when we're depressed, our ability to taste sweet is actually decreased, and our ability to perceive sour, unfortunately, increases.
No, you're kidding. Really?
No. So sour grapes are even more sour that way. But the other problem is that the taste of something sweet like cookies isn't as intense. So we might eat more of those cookies now, which we may not after the fact want to do, even though we're trying to make ourselves feel good with some comfort food. Now, the other side of this is actually what the second part of the question, how taste can influence our mood. And actually, eating something sweet will temporarily make you feel more agreeable and nicer. So it doesn't last necessarily a long time, but one of the really good reasons why when people bring like baked goods to a meeting, especially if we're going to be talking about some difficult thing at work, like everyone gets happier when they've just had a bite of some like sweet baked thing, and then they're going to be much more likely to be sort of accommodating in the discussion. So it's not an accident that bringing, some kind of sweet treats to the meeting is actually something that's beneficial beyond, breakfast.
How long are we how long are we talking? Like minutes? Are we talking like an hour? Like what's the,
So that's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, but it certainly lasts at least as long as you're eating it. Now, the problems also that can happen when you're eating something is, let's say someone brings this big box of donuts, they look fantastic, you eat one, and you're like, oh, this feels great, I'm really happy eating it. But then you start going, oh no, I ate a donut, or maybe I ate 3 donuts, and then you start feeling bad about yourself for doing that. So there's also that sort of flip side, depending upon how your relationship with food is, that can sometimes sort of start taking you in the other direction. But certainly, as long as you're feeling the goodness and for at least a couple of minutes afterwards, that sense of happiness and collaboration and agreeableness persists.
Yeah. Awesome stuff. So many questions in the Q&A. So I am going to ask a favor of folks. If you see questions in there that you want Rachel to weigh in on, please give them a thumbs up, because we have limited time and a lot of questions, and I'm going to try to get to as many of these as we can. We have a lot of people who are wondering if they know, do we know the reason why the COVID virus is affecting smell and taste? What do we know about where we're at with that?
So actually, we do know. And what happens is, so you know that it's SARS-CoV-2 is the name of the virus, and the way that it enters cell, people may have heard of this, is spike protein concept. So the spike protein actually needs to find a cell that it can enter into to spread itself through and get into our system. And inside the nose, there are 3 types of cells that are on this olfactory epithelium I mentioned before. They're the sensory neurons that do the smelling, But then there are these two other types of cells, what are called basal cells and sustentacular or supporting cells. And it's actually those supporting cells where they have a very, very high expression of what is known as ACE2 receptors. And the ACE2 receptor is really highly able to accept a spike protein into it. That's the major binding point for spike proteins into our bodies. So the spike protein enters into the sustentacular, the supporting cell, and that's how it invades our system. Now, what happens is, as a function of this, supporting cell getting infected, it creates a big inflammatory response. And so it's not that the sensory neurons for smell themselves have gotten disrupted, but the inflammation causes those neurons to stop functioning properly. And so we lose our ability to smell, or we start smelling things that smell weird or different. So another symptom, in addition to losing sensitivity, is that things smell wrong or off. It's called parosmia.
Yeah.
So that's another symptom that can happen as a function of this inflammation, which just makes things run amok. But one of the things I have a super pet peeve about is when people wear masks and they do not cover their noses, because your nose is actually the primary place that the virus is entering your body through. So, and it's also—
Cover those noses, people. Get a nose mask. Get a nose mask for under the face mask.
Yeah. And the other thing that might be involved too, we don't exactly know how much that this is actually happening, but the virus may also be being shed from the nose, even more so than the mouth. So breathing through the nose and exhaling, that might be also where the virus is being shed from the body too. So really important to cover your nose.
Yeah. All right. So we've got a question. A lot of people asking to hear a little bit more about this correlation that we kind of started with that idea between smell and memory. S. Stein asks, would scent trigger a possible awakening in people suffering from dementia, as they found music can sometimes do, where someone will just be able to sing a song that they love from back in the day, even though they're like nonverbal, non-communicative? What do we know about smell therapeutically that way?
So that's also a really excellent question. So yes, smell is actually probably one of the best cues for being able to bring people back who have lost connections with loved ones through, I'm seeing my daughter, but I don't know who she is, but she brings in the perfume she used to wear when she was 30. And now the person can sort of feel the recognition of that individual. Now, the problem is with dementia, especially Alzheimer's, which is the most common form, the more serious that disease becomes, the more of the brain becomes damaged, and actually the part of the brain where smell is processed gets damaged. And so that starts to fall off and not be successful at being able to trigger memories and get, loved ones kind of back in connection with each other. But before that happens, it's certainly an amazing way to bring people together, to bring back a memory connection, to make that person, also the person suffering, can feel more of a sense of themselves, more connected to their own past history when they smell things that maybe for them trigger their own personal memories, when this person was a child, or when this person, took some special trip, maybe there was some scent involved with that. And something that I always like to do is actually scent stamp special occasions for myself. Like I'll buy a special perfume, to go on a special trip, and then I'll only wear that perfume during the trip, and then afterwards I can smell it and then bring back specifically the memory of that. So that's also something that it really works phenomenally well, but only if the disease hasn't progressed too far.
Yeah. We've got a question here, which is a fascinating one. So L. Bergendal says, they find when they cook and they're smelling it the entire time while they're cooking, they're either not as hungry, or they're feeling like it doesn't quite taste as good when they actually eat it as it would have been if somebody else cooked it for them. So does smelling food prior to eating it either blunt the taste somehow, or like make it less special when you get to the eating part?
So that's a really interesting question, and it can actually go both ways. So you could be smelling the food and going, oh, wow, I can't wait to eat it because it's actually whetting my appetite. Or you can actually become sort of satiated on the smell and then not feel like eating it anymore. But another thing that's going on, and this is something that I also work on, is how when we're exposed to a scent for any length of time, we actually stop being able to detect it. So you're cooking over the stove, and at the beginning, the garlic and the onions, you can really smell them. And then after a few minutes, it's really starting to be much weaker, and you're not really getting that same sensation. And that's because the sensory neurons have actually stopped responding to those aromas. And the same thing can also happen, like if you have a perfume or a cologne you wear every day, you end up after a few months, you're like, the genie left the bottle. What's going on here? Like, I can't smell it anymore, but you know,
Yeah.
you're dusting it over your head and everyone else can. So there's a bunch of things going on. So both the fact that you may have adapted to it and you're not really getting it anymore. So food, like the person mentioned, you know, you're not getting the same sort of big flavor experience because they've adapted to the aroma component, as well as the fact they could have kind of burnt out on it. Like, okay, I'm full of that smell already. Give me something different.
So for the sake of your friends, if you're a cologne wearer or a perfume wearer, switch it up every once in a while so you don't get crazy with the amount you're putting on. Everybody got this, a public service announcement coming to you from Rachel via me. Rachel, I wish we could keep going. We are just about out of time, but one of the good things is you mentioned sort of earlier, you have done some writing, you have some books out there. So if I want to get more of this kind of stuff, where do I go? Tell me where I can get your books, what your books are. What do I do?
So this is my most recent book, Why You Eat What You Eat, the science behind our relationship with food. It is available everywhere you can get books. I've also written a book called The Scent of Desire, which is all about the psychology of smell, as well as a book called That's Disgusting, which is about the emotion of disgust. And disgust is actually a taste-based emotion, which you can find out if you get the book.
Fascinating stuff. Dr. Rachel Herz, neuroscientist, expert in smell. Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And I'm going to get your book as soon as this thing's over.
Thank you very much, Edgar. And it was great to be here.
Thank you for being with us. And now let's turn things over to our second and final speaker, Dr. Vayu Maini Rekdal. He is a chef, educator, and scientist. Vayu, thanks for being with us here on Boston Talks.
Thank you, Edgar. It's great to return to Boston virtually. I moved away from Boston pretty recently, but it's nice to be here in a virtual sense.
Yeah, it's great to talk to you again, gang at home. You can check this, and maybe we'll include this in an email to you later. But I spoke with Vayu for a story that I did for the Curiosity Desk years ago about whether any two popcorn kernels might ever be the same. So people say no two snowflakes would be alike. We were asked, would the same be true of popcorn? And Vayu, correct me if I'm wrong, but you essentially figured nobody's actually studied it, but probably no two popcorn kernels would be alike, right?
I think that was our conclusion. Nobody has, I think, done the study yet.
I'm still waiting for you to do that study, but
if I only had time, if I had time.
Understandable. So, Vayu, let's talk a little bit about you. Chef, scientist, educator. Which came first in this? Were you a chef who was like, I want to know more about the science? Were you a scientist who wanted to know more about food? Were you an educator who wanted to study more about both? Well, how did this all sort of come together?
It's a great question, and I think it's been a journey where I ended up in a place where I never had expected when I first started out. So right now I just earned my PhD at Harvard in biochemistry, and right now I'm a researcher, kind of studying how we can harness microorganisms for food production to produce delicious food in a sustainable way. So how did I get there? Actually, my journey into science and into this world of food and science started in the kitchen in Stockholm, Sweden, where I grew up. So I actually was born outside of the US in Stockholm, Sweden, but I was born in a multicultural home. So I have roots in Cuba, India, and Norway. And growing up, the way that I got connected and got to know where I came from was through the food, very much through the aromas, through the taste, through the flavors. So early on in my life, I fell in love with food and cooking as a window into my cultural heritage. And later, just as a passion and interest that I loved, I would host dinner parties, cook at home, and help out. And so when I was 18, I actually decided to pursue this in a more professional context, moving to New York City on my own from Sweden, working in restaurants and actually working in food, making money of this sort of passion that I had cultivated early on. And while in New York, I got really excited about, I want to work with food. This is going to be my career. This is going to be my life. And I had all these, big plans. And I had a friend at the time who said, maybe you should think about going to college. That could be a way for you to maybe learn more or think in a different way. And maybe it would be easier for you to make one of these ideas reality. So I applied to colleges. I got into one and I moved to Minnesota, Northfield, Minnesota, from New York City. And when I came to college, I found myself being very confused because I loved cooking. I loved smell and taste and working with my hands. And then in a liberal arts college, I had to take classes on philosophy and biology and chemistry and physics, and really didn't really see how these things fit together. But it was during my time in college that I made that connection to science, because I realized that the physics, the biology, the chemistry that I was learning in the classroom, it actually helped me understand the food that I cooked, so I could become a better chef.
Had you been into science like as a young pup, like in Sweden, or not really?
Honestly, I think I have found it, it's fun, it's all right, but I never seen the relevance to my own life. It had felt very much like a separate part of my life, school. And then I had maybe things that I was interested in or cared about. And so making that connection and that really kind of crystallizing for me, it changed my life. And part of that was I had a chance early in college to go to work in sort of a food science lab in Spain called Fundación Alicia, started by this 3-star Michelin chef called Ferran Adria, very innovative, kind of avant-garde chef. And he had a center kind of dedicated to research with food and science. And then I was like, wow, this is actually a thing. This is a thing you can do. And so, yes, I started in cooking and sort of made my way into science, going to my PhD, and now eventually where I'm at today.
It's wild. That is a serious journey. And also, like, I think encouraging, like, I find it fascinating that, like, again, sort of naturally, you weren't necessarily like turned on by science, but once you found where it applied into your life, you pursue it all the way up through a PhD, and now are, essentially like a scientist doing original research today. Like that's fascinating.
The kitchen. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, the kitchen is just an incredible, I think, place where we interact with science every day. We may just think of it as as cooking or eating, but as Rachel highlighted, it's in a very beautiful way. There's a sense of smell, and there's neuroscience behind how we interact with our food. There's also physics and chemistry in how we prepare our food. So it's really cool when you start making those connections.
Yeah. So what is it that you're working on now? Right now, as I understand, the big thing for you is microbes.
Exactly. So I am enamored by microorganisms. I fell in love with them during my PhD, and I've really kind of been on this journey investigating how microbes, so microorganisms, we can define them as organisms that we cannot see with our naked eye, such as bacteria, fungi, or yeast. So these microbes actually have been on a journey kind of interrogating how they influence our interactions with food. So it turns out that, we may not pay a lot of attention to these microbes, but they're critical for how we interact with our food. For example, when you eat, we have trillions of microbes living inside of our bodies, in our gastrointestinal tract, in our gut. That's called the gut microbiota. These microbes, when you eat something, digest your food and break it down. So I spent my PhD studying that.
Did you say trillions with a T?
Trillions, trillions, indeed. We have many, many microscopic creatures living inside us, and they're critical for how we interact with our food, because when we eat, they help us digest the food and actually give us nutrients from it. So that's one aspect that I've kind of investigated and thought about microbes and food. But right now, what I'm really excited about is thinking about sort of in the kitchen. How can we actually harness microorganisms for producing food? And this is not a new idea. You might have heard about the concept of fermentation. Fermented foods are widely popular, and they're some of, I think, the favorite foods that we love and cherish all around the world. And I'm kind of studying and understanding how these traditional processes work, microbes making food, flavors and textures, and also how we can kind of take it into the future.
So how is it, I mean, you talk about the fact that, like, fermented foods are like sort of some of our favorite foods. This is a process that obviously humans have worked out, a long time ago, and have been sort of using, when it comes to food for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. What's the sort of leading edge of that? What's new to be found in that? Where are the new places to go with something that seems to sort of be like, well, it's been around forever?
So that's a great question. I think there's a lot of different directions we can go in when it comes to microbes and food. So as I said, microbes produce many of the foods that we love. Examples are cheese, yogurt. You might have heard of kombucha. We have various pickled, lacto-fermented vegetables, miso, soy sauce. The list is very long, and every culture on this planet have found some way to harness microbes for food production. And when we think about sort of what microbes are doing, there's a few things that they can do. They can help us preserve the food. So it's a question of kind of sustainability. If you have a harvest in the fall, for example, excess cabbages, by preserving it with kimchi or sauerkraut, you now can store those nutrients and store those sort of vegetables throughout the year. So there's an element of preservation and naturally occurring preservation. The other thing is actually something as simple as flavor. Because microbes are microscopic chemists. They can do things where they can break down proteins and carbohydrates, sort of these complex molecules present in food, breaking them down and producing new molecules that we taste or we smell or we just sense as flavor. So when we look ahead towards the future, there are many kind of ways that we can take advantage of that. One of them is kind of how can we use microbes to produce maybe food from food waste. So when we cook at home or on large scales, when we produce food, we'll take sort of a raw product and we'll use some of it, but some of it we might actually toss out. So think of it at home. You have a leafy vegetable, kale. You maybe use the leaves, but you'll throw out the stems. It actually turns out that those stems are edible. They're full of nutrients. But maybe we don't want to eat them because the flavor isn't right there. The texture isn't perfect yet.
They're not as delicious.
Exactly. But microbes can bring that out for us because microbes, microscopic chemists, can break that down and produce something new for us. And so, one angle is really thinking about how can we harness these food-borne microbes in new ways, in new contexts, and think about, sustainably producing food waste being one of them. And there's a lot of other kind of directions we can go in, but that's one of them that I'm really excited about.
So how might we, or I mean, maybe this is the work that you do. How do you begin to sort of tackle that? Like, do you test pairing different microbes with different food wastes and say, like, let's try putting these two together and see if it's delicious afterwards? Or like, is it as simple as that, or is it more complicated?
It's a great question. And I think actually this is sort of a newer area, I think, where we don't necessarily have a template for how to kind of bridge these world of hardcore kind of science and microbiology and chemistry with sort of the area of gastronomy and cooking. So, as I'm entering into this area and this space, I'm learning that there's a lot of things to be figured out in terms of how to do this and how to actually do this in a way that satisfies kind of both the scientific side, but also the culinary side, the emotions, the taste, the flavor. So in terms of food waste, one way you can do is to say, here's different microbes, here are different food waste streams, let's combine them and sort of see what comes out. Now, the tricky thing there is that it's sort of hard to predict and hard to control. And you don't really know sort of maybe the microbe is going to be acting in a weird way when it encounters something it normally doesn't grow on and so forth. So there's some sort of caveats to that. Another approach is to actually look around the world and see what people have already done. So, what are people already doing? Because this challenge of sustainability, this challenge of sort of food supply and meeting sort of demands when certain things aren't available, that's not a new idea. People have had to solve that in in local contexts for hundreds of years or decades. So it turns out that food waste, for example, is something that people have already addressed. So I think it's very promising to kind of look at what have people already done. Something that is well established, where we know it's tasty, we know it's nutritious. Maybe we can learn from that as a starting point, celebrating kind of human ingenuity and innovation that has already occurred. And the specific thing that I'm looking at is a process from Java in Indonesia. Java is an island in Indonesia, and there people use a specific kind of mold to mix it with certain waste streams. So leftovers from soy milk or tofu production, or leftovers from peanut oil production. You can mix that with a specific mold and produce a delicious food that is cherished, and it's called red oncom. So that's kind of what I mean, that we can learn maybe from what's been done and what's already been achieved, and use it as a starting point.
Cool stuff. And we've got a question from Charmin who asks, is there a way to customize diets for individuals based on their particular gut biome, or to prescribe a diet to help people with digestive issues? So this is sort of, kind of in the microbe world. Can you do anything on a customized basis?
It's something that I think a lot of people want to achieve and a lot of people are working towards. I think we're learning, more and more about the microbes that are living inside us, how they digest our food, how it impacts our health. We're learning that different people have different microbes living inside them. And so when different people get the same food, they might have very different effects depending on the microbes that live in there. Now, we're not quite yet, I think, at a point where we can rationally say, oh, you have these microbes, so we should prescribe you kind of this diet. We're not quite there where we can do that, I think, in a sort of precise way. But some of my PhD research tried to address that by looking at, molecules that are present in fruits and vegetables, for example. How are they being broken down? How are they being broken down by different microbes? And by understanding that, we can sort of move in that direction. I think there's a lot of promise, there's a lot of excitement. And as the research is building, I hope that we can get to that point.
Interesting stuff. All right, question from Stuart. Asking you to comment on hyperlocal natural fermentation. So examples that Stuart puts here: soy sauce made with local open air organisms in New York City or Lower Manhattan, and that's going to taste different than soy sauce made the same way it maybe in Boston's Back Bay. So how same ingredients, how different will they taste when they're fermented by different bacteria? People do this with sourdough for bread too, right? Like sort of like sitting out in different locations to give it a little different flavor. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think we talk a lot about sort of that idea of terroir, like, just the land and the nature and sort of how it influences fermentation and the process. And actually some of the science that has come out is sort of challenge that idea a little bit. So when we look at cheese, great work done by Ben Wolf at Tufts University and Rachel Dutton, who's now at UCSD, they've looked at cheese sort of in this direction. They published a big paper in 2014, and they were asking, if we look at the microbes that live in the cheese and we sort of look across the world, is it the geographic location that matters, or is it the type of cheese? And they actually sort of found, surprisingly, that the location wasn't as important as other factors in terms of determining who lived in, in the food. However, I think this sort of jury is still out, and people are working heavily and intensely to kind of understand, because I think from a sensory perspective, like, we do know that maybe there is something special if you do that open air fermentation of soy sauce in New York City versus if you do it in Japan. And so, some of the research has come out is challenging this idea of terroir, but I think we're, more work has to be done to really kind of say yes or no. And I'll also say that, when it comes to fermentation, there's different ways of doing it. So you're talking about sort of hyperlocal wild fermentations. One of the ways to ferment is just you leave things open and you let the environment around you colonize and sort of colonize the food, and that's sort of where you start. So sourdough is an example. You just add water and flour, and whatever is around you will sort of grow and make it. Other fermentations, we actually add what's called an inoculum. We add a microbe. We just pour it in, and we know what that is, and we want a specific outcome. An example of that is soy sauce or miso, where we add a specific mold called Aspergillus oryzae. We add that in, we control that, we know what it is. Many cheeses are actually produced that way. So some blue cheese, we add a specific microbe in. So sort of that the hyperlocal idea can also vary, I think, depending on if you just leave it open or whether you actually are adding something and what goes into it.
Interesting stuff. All right, we got a question from Christy who's asking about, you sort of talk about, the idea of, food waste and maybe working with microbes to be able to transform it into something delicious. What about non-green food waste, Christy asks? For instance, eggshells, coffee grinds, other things that, a person might be composting.
Fantastic idea. So yeah, it's not just kind of pulpy stuff or green stuff. There's actually sort of an idea to use, maybe eggshells or things that we don't really think of as food, edible, if they're transformed or not. So one sort of idea that's evolving in that department is maybe we can grow food on these waste substrates. So specifically, there's a big sort of interest in mushrooms and molds and fungi. so there's a company, for example, in Copenhagen that takes coffee grounds, collects them from restaurants, and then uses that to grow lion's mane mushrooms, oyster mushrooms, and other mushrooms. So the food waste becomes a substrate for something to grow, such as a mushroom, and then we eat the mushroom, we pick the mushroom, we don't eat the waste. And so when there's sort of that, I guess, that sort of space where maybe it's not so edible or maybe it's not so interesting, we can feed it to other organisms, which then can kind of convert it to food for us, if that makes sense. And I'm really excited about that too.
Excellent stuff. Excellent stuff. Vayu, we've got a bunch of questions here around probiotics. So, asking about, specifically like supplements or like, effective, like, how do you know what's an effective probiotic? Which yogurt, and also questions about like supplements, are they just as good? Yay, nay, gut health and probiotics. Help us.
Yeah, health and probiotics.
There's so much stuff out there. Help us.
I wish I could help you. I think my answer is that there's a lot of marketing behind it. There's a lot of sort of money invested into making people believe that this is the cure for it all. My take is that it's not harmful, but I'm not sure it's as amazing as marketed. I think the research is showing that some of the supplements, for example, that we take in pill form, they don't really maybe establish themselves so well in the normal gut, or they don't really colonize in the way that we think. And so I think the same thing about fermented foods. People think, oh, fermented foods it's so groundbreaking and so healthy. Well, it's not bad for you. I don't think it does any harm. I just think, based on the research, that we're not in this place where we can say this is a super clear health benefit from this specific food and it'll fix this specific problem. I think eating a varied diet and fermented foods being part of that it's delicious and it's not harmful. But sadly, based on the research, I don't have to say I can't say to you, yeah, it's all that it promises to be. I think there's a lot of left to understand.
What's it going to take to get there in terms of understanding? Is it an area where there is a lot of research going on and we're learning more every day and there's more to learn, or is it like anything else and it's going to take a lot of time to really understand it? And
Actually, it's a very good question. When I started my PhD back in 2015, sort of the gut microbiome was a new field, and people, it was just kind of starting to become, I guess, interesting, and money was coming into it. Now it's really kind of blowing up, and a lot of investment and a lot of effort. So a lot of clever people are working on this, and we're starting to see maybe some sort of application in that department. So I have hope that we'll get answers. It might not be the answers that we want, but we are learning and we are getting answers. And the similar thing goes with, I think, with fermented food and fermentation. People are studying it more and thinking about it and investigating it. And so we're in an exciting time of microbial foods, both when it comes to our body and also producing food.
Good question here. I really like this question because I like baking bread, but Jackson asks, Jackson says, I have a medieval sourdough starter. Is it really, quote unquote, 1,000 years old? Like, you see these, like, people talk about this is a sourdough starter that is like been cultivated for, like, is it really old? Is it really that old?
So something I think that is an interesting sort of answer to that is that, let's say you've had your sourdough starter for 20 years or so, and you've just, you've maintained it, you've fed it, continued it. Now, what happens, every time you passage it or feed it, it evolves. So no matter if you've been maintaining it, for a long time, it's going to change. It's not going to be what it was when it first started. And so it's kind of an interesting dimension that, like, you're kind of farming these microbes. And what we know from domestication of animals, like, I don't know, wolves, they sort of eventually were transitioning towards dogs. The same thing is happening with microbes. And so, your community is changing and evolving, even if you claim that it was established in medieval times.
Interesting. And does it retain anything from way back then? Probably not after thousands of years, right? I mean,
exactly. I think it's sort of, it's hard to say this is what it was back then. People are reviving old beers or finding sort of old wines, and I think over time microbes can change too.
A couple people want me to ask this question. It's a pretty broad one. but it would be great to hear you address it. And the question is simply, it comes from Jill, are GMOs harmful? GMOs, are they harmful? I mean, that's a big question, obviously, but
it's a big question, and I think there's a lot of kind of nuances to sort of discussing it. I sincerely believe, as a scientist, that GMOs are not inherently harmful. There's actually a lot of, GMO is not a new thing. I think it's often presented as kind of this new sort of sci-fi-like idea, but over thousands of years, over centuries, we have been doing GMO by plant breeding. Corn, for example, came from a grass called teosinte in Mexico. And through sort of selecting the right sort of teosinte fruits and mixing them and stuff, we eventually got to a place called corn. It's an ancient tradition to do, GMO, but we have done it by different methods. Now we have new scientific techniques. We can do it at a faster scale in a laboratory. And so I think that has a lot of promise, actually, as we look to the food of the future. I think it's not inherently bad, and it can actually help us address challenges such as related to climate change, related to nutrition, related to increasing yields. But there's nuances kind of around business around GMOs and sort of how it's managed, maybe, that I think people have issues here. We can discuss the sort of political implications and otherwise around it. But as an idea, I think GMO is something very valuable and has actually been practiced for many, many years. And that's something we often don't sort of bring into the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, are there aspects of it, or maybe, it sounds like kind of what you're saying a little bit is that, like, when we say GMO, what is it that we're really talking about? And are there particular techniques now that weren't around before, or is there things happening at such a quick pace that maybe took hundreds or thousands of years to do in the past that give you pause, or that, or that we should keep an eye on? Or is it just like generally, I don't know, it's a case by case basis?
I think it's a case-by-case basis, and I think the technique allows us to just do old things in new ways and at a faster rate. And I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that.
All right. Vayu, if I'm interested in what I heard you say today, and I want to know more about you or your work or the kind of stuff that you're into, where can I go? Where should I go?
Yeah, you can follow my journey on my Instagram. I post photos of my fungi and microbes that I work with. It's vayu.mr. And also go to my website, VayuMainiRekdal.com, and follow the journey at the interface of science, food, and microbes. Thank you so much.
Excellent. Vayu, thank you so much for being with us. My thanks to Rachel for being with us. And a huge thank you to you for hanging out with us, hanging out with me from my living room here in Somerville for the last hour. It's been great having you with us.